Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UNI-LEAD webinar series. This is the first of several webinars that we will be holding on the topic of climate finance. These webinars are intended to serve as a resource for members of the LDC University Consortium on Climate Change related to key aspects of climate finance, and the webinars aim to strengthen the ability of university faculty to advise their governments on climate finance. This and the other webinars in the series will be available on the UNI-LEAD project website. So after this webinar, you can share it with team members within the LUC network. Let me just make my screen large here. Okay, first webinar will focus on basics of climate finance. We'll begin with an introduction to climate finance by Dr. Chipo Mubaya, climate funding landscape by Dr. Moussa Mamouda, and economics and politics, excuse me, of climate finance by Mizan. A couple of procedural issues here. This will be recorded, as I mentioned before. If you have any questions you want to ask, please put them in the chat window, and we will address the questions after the webinar individually. I also ask that you kindly put your full name, your institution name, your country, and your email in the chat window as well, so we can keep track of who's attended the webinar. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chipo to provide an introduction to climate finance.
Thank you very much, John. Hello, everyone. My name is Chipo Plaxedes Mubaya, and I'm working with the UNI-LEAD project as a capacity development specialist. So today I'm going to give a presentation to you on the introduction to climate finance. And it's a brief presentation that will focus on a few issues to do with why we talk about climate finance and what it is, and also the framework around the principles. Next slide, please. So this is the presentation outline I've set, so I'll not repeat this one. Next slide. Thank you. So perhaps just to highlight the objectives of the webinar. Next slide, please, John, before I move straight into the introduction, just so that the expectation is generally to enhance in participants' capacity to be able to highlight the scope and rationale of climate finance, to be able to conceptualize the framework around principles of climate finance, as well as apply their understanding around issues to do with stakeholders, institutions, and the climate finance fund landscape, as will be detailed today. Next slide, please. So to get into the introduction, climate finance refers to funding from the local, national, or transnational context. So it's financing in this context. And it's generally drawn from public, private, and alternative sources of finance, and with the aim of, at national level, but also at the local level, to be able to enhance changes in people's lives and well-being ultimately. But this should support climate action towards mitigation in helping reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, but also in terms of action, in terms of adaptation, that is by addressing vulnerability issues to climate change. And there's a general principle around climate finance, which highlights that this financial assistance should flow from more endowed developed countries to less endowed developing countries. Next slide. So there's this general understanding from the UNFCCC objectives reaffirmed by the Paris Agreement in terms of highlighting that there's a common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. So responsibility and obligation in this context coming from the developed countries that are, have agreed to fund, to mobilize resources and provide these resources for developing countries, with the understanding that they are the ones who have historically and currently produced these emissions more than anybody else, and therefore they have an obligation to fund the less developed countries so that they also mitigate and also address the impacts that are coming from climate change. So the Paris Agreement then affirms these obligations, and also in addition encourages voluntary contributions by other parties as well to ensure that climate finance is provided to developed country parties and developing country parties, and these developed countries take a lead in mobilizing climate finance from a variety of sources. And this will be highlighted later in the other two modules that are to come. But the UNFCCC website is something that you can visit, actually provides a climate finance data portal that has 3 modules. And the first one is on national communications, where information is provided from the contributing countries on the provision of financial resources. And this is in their context in terms of regular reporting to the convention. But the second module as well provides the context of commitment to providing USD 30 billion, which is highlighted there, over a period of time. But generally it provides information on resources provided by developed countries in this context. And then the third module provides information on funds that are managed by the GEF. And these funds are then provided, and there is information there in terms of climate finance flows and the role of the GEF as one of the operating entities of the financial mechanisms of the convention. So there's also additional information there on projects coming from the Adaptation Fund and so on. But the general idea is to ensure that that information is available on activities funded in developing countries, specifically targeted to climate action, and provided to parties and operating entities of financial mechanisms. Please go to the next slide. Thank you. So now the question is, why should we be talking about climate finance? How have we reached the point of now having these conversations and discussions around climate finance? Next slide, please. I've talked about the global commitments that have been made in terms of providing funds. But from 2015 at COP21, there was commitments by countries to come up with nationally determined contributions. And these were towards meeting the Paris Agreement. And at the same time, the understanding around domestic national adaptation plans or engagements that were going on and are still going on in specific countries, individual countries, around coming up with a plan of adaptation, the specific adaptation actions and how they've been prioritized, and how these governments intend to actually mobilize resources and what resources are required for these specific prioritized adaptation actions. And 5 years later, 6 years later, at COP26, there was many countries actually updated their NDCs following recent information that was on the progression of climate change evidence on the progression of climate change that was there at that time. And many countries registered new NDCs and others updated theirs. And there was still that same arrangement around NAP engagements across different countries. But with the realization that these NAPs and also the NDC commitments on their own would be insufficient, given the huge sums of funds that are required to fund national adaptation, as well as to help with mitigation in individual countries. So this led to a discussion around how much funding is required and where this funding should come from and where it should go and how it should be spent. So this conversation then led to the critical decisions around climate finance with the overall aim, as I've said earlier on, to achieve well-being and prosperity across the globe in the coming years. Next slide, please. So essentially, what is coming out so far from what I've presented is that climate finance is really critical to mitigate emissions coming from that are causing climate change, but also to help communities and economies adapt to climate change. And that commitment that developed countries should provide financial resources to help developing countries meet their NDCs, pay for mitigation, but also to be able to adapt and mobilize more climate finance. Next slide. But it's important to understand before any funds could be mobilized, any resources could be mobilized, it was important to understand what the global climate finance gap is. And the understanding here, statistics are showing that in terms of adaptation, between 180 to 300 billion US dollars per year would be required by 2030 in order to fund adaptation activities at different levels within specific countries. And mitigation, on the other hand, USD 850 billion per year would be required by 2030. So as we can see, this is quite a huge gap and a huge climate finance gap that needs to be completed. Unfortunately, there are indications that these funds have not been, the targets have not been met, and not enough or sufficient funds have been mobilized so far. There's still quite a long way to go. So this is very critical that the conversations around climate finance continue to be held and solutions are found on how to move forward. Next slide. So now I'll end this brief session by talking about the framework around climate finance principles, which have been put together from different documents to show how the financial contributions should be mobilized and administered and dispersed as well. And these principles are categorized around 3 funding delivery phases. Next slide. And these are the 3 phases. The first phase is the mobilization of the funds itself. For any climate financing to be successful, it's important to have extensive fund mobilization. The second phase entails fund administration and governance. And the last of these 3 phases is to ensure disbursement and implementation of these funds. So I'll then, in the next 3 slides, I'm going to run through the different principles and criteria that are contained in terms of this framework and what is expected, at least what should happen if climate financing is going to be successful. Next slide. So what is coming out strongly and what is critical is the polluter pays principle, which speaks and responds to what I've already talking about in terms of financial contributions, how they should be relative to the quantity of historic and current emissions produced. So this leads us to that understanding around obligations and responsibility by developed nations to provide to other developing country parties. And we also, with the understanding that the funds that are to be provided in this context should stand alone, independent from the overseas development assistance that is for a long time gone to development, developing countries. So these two should be considered separately. The climate finance should specifically target climate action around mitigation, adaptation, as we have said, and should be considered separate from other development commitments and contributions that have been ongoing. And that is critical for this climate financing to be successful. But there's also the need to have the contribution and funding being secure and being quite predictable and known over the different funding cycles. In addition, what is also critical is the understanding that there should be transparency and accountability. And this principle of transparency and accountability actually runs through the three different funding, where the principle highlights that financial contributions by the individual countries and international organizations should be clear and publicly disclosed in a timely manner. And all the various stakeholders must be aware of what is happening in terms of fund mobilization, who has mobilized what, and what are these funds designed for, and who is targeted. All that information must be clear according to this principle. And also the principle of adequacy. The expectation is that this amount of funding should be sufficient to deal with the global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius as agreed in the Paris Agreement. And this is very critical. Next slide, please. As I have highlighted, the principle of transparency and accountability being very important, and within the administration and governance phase, it's expected that transparency and accountability should be there around provision of accurate and timely information on funding. The structure itself must be very clear. The data, financial data, should be available to everybody and in a clear and accurate way. Decision-making processes also must ensure that they take into account the various stakeholders, and this leads to ensuring that there is equitable representation within this context, and representation not just of the stakeholders or the developed countries that are contributing, but also in terms of the recipient countries. They should have space, they should have a voice as well in order to ensure that everybody is represented. So these are the two principles for the second phase of delivery. Next slide. And the last phase, which is around disbursement and implementation of the funds, the various principles touch around transparency, as already highlighted. This is critical, but more important, there is the issue of national and local ownership, where funding decisions should transcend. They should not only include, as I have said, the contributors, but also the developing countries themselves, and even below the governments themselves who are involved in the decision-making processes and negotiations, but also move to the sub-national and local levels to ensure that everybody is on board and there's that sense of ownership, and implementation can then become successful in this case. And there is, in the same context, need to ensure that whatever climate finance investment decisions are made, take into account existing sustainable development objectives within countries in order to not contradict what is already on the ground or violate basic human rights, but ensure that these are run together, existing objectives within specific countries. And of course, the issue that I've talked about, equitable representation, but going beyond that to coming up, ensuring that there's gender equality, voices are heard, decisions are made together with those people who are targeted, and looking into different capacities, needs, and identities, not only of gender groups, but taking into account the different intersectionality issues that also that are also at play. And lastly, also ensuring that the financing instruments that are used do not impose a burden or injustice within recipient countries. I'm going to stop here for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chipo. That was a very helpful introduction to the topic. Our next speaker is Moussa, who will provide information about the climate funding landscape. And while I've got the mic, just a reminder, please, to put your full name, institution name, country, and email in the chat window so we can track who's on this at this webinar. Okay, thank you very much. Moussa, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, John, and good morning or good evening, everyone. My name is Moussa Abou Mamouda. I work for Climate Analytics, which is the organization designated as a mentor institution under this UNI-LEAD project being managed by START International. And this module, which is about climate funding landscape, actually it will take you through the landscape of climate finance. Since this first webinar is about basics of climate finance, this module we will go through. We thought that one of the basic questions to answer in this module will be, what are the climate funds that are actually currently existing, and who are the big players in funding climate action, and what are the major donors you could knock the door at to find funding for your projects for addressing climate action. So this module will try to shed light and answer some of these questions. Next, please. And in terms of the outline, in order to answer these questions I have highlighted, we organized this module around 6 sections. We will start by showing the big picture of climate finance architecture, and then look at climate funds at 3 levels. The first level will be the international level, the second one, the regional level, and the third one, the national level. At the international level, we will talk about multilateral climate funds with a focus on some of the major climate funds and the financial mechanisms affiliated with the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, like the Adaptation Fund, the GEF, and the GCF. And we will also look at multilateral banks hosting important climate funds. We'll also talk about carbon market, and then dig down to look at regional and national funds. Next, please. So like I have said, this slide shows the big picture of climate finance. It shows what are the major climate finance funds, and these can be grouped into 3 main categories. The first category is the international funds, which is the column in the middle. And under the international funds, we have the multilateral and the bilateral funds. This is the first category. The second category, on the left side of this slide, we have the domestic finance, under which we have all sources that countries could use to mobilize climate finance. And then the third category is the private finance, mainly composed of private companies and other climate financiers. Next, please. And in this slide, we are just showing that according to the Climate Fund Update Initiative, which is an initiative being managed by the Heinrich Böll Foundation, there could be more than 100 of climate funds globally, out of which up to 27 are multilateral funds. And this slide is showing the funds that are supporting in one side Africa, and the others that are supporting in the other side the Asia region, which are actually the two regions where we have the biggest number of least developed countries where these LDCs are located. And we will come back with more details in further slides with regard to these funds. Next, please. So, like I've said in previous slide, we stated that climate finance is regrouped. It can be grouped into three categories: the domestic, the international, including multilateral and bilateral finance, and then the third category is the private finance. So, looking at the difference now between two of these categories, namely the domestic and the international, this graphic actually is showing the distribution of these two categories depending on the regions. It appears that Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are the regions where domestic finance is less available. And this is clearly confirming the fact that although these countries contributed the less in creating the climate crisis we are experiencing, these countries are actually the ones that are less equipped to address climate change with their own national funds at national level. Next, please. So after this quick overview, the next slides will take you through some of the major climate funds. Since this webinar is about basics of climate finance, we will look at general information about these major funds, and we will start with the adaptation fund. In terms of general information about the adaptation fund, we thought useful to talk about the history of the fund. To say that the adaptation fund was created in 2001 under the Kyoto Protocol, which is now being replaced by the Paris Agreement. And at that time, most of climate actions were oriented actually on mitigation. And people were wondering, what is adaptation? What is adaptation looking like? And then the adaptation fund was there, and it was designed with the objective of financing concrete adaptation projects so that people can learn what actually adaptation is. And the formal sources of funding for the adaptation fund was 2% of share of proceeds from the Clean Development Mechanism project. But so far, many bilateral donors also have contributed to the funds for the adaptation fund so far. Next, please. And in this slide, it is about presenting the different partners that are interacting with the adaptation fund. Two major actors, actually, the designated authorities and the implementing entities. By designated authorities, we have the government representative from the countries that are serving as focal points, as well as they are also responsible on behalf of the national government to approve requests for accreditation or proposals from accredited institutions. And on the right, we have the implementing entities, which are actually the national, the regional, or multilateral institutions accredited to the adaptation fund. And it is about using these national implementing entities as well as the regional entities or the multilateral implementing entities to access the funds. So if countries want to access the funds, they have to use all these entities. Next, please. And in this slide, we have the strategic areas of intervention of the adaptation fund. And these strategic areas are basically major domains in which the adaptation fund is putting its money. And these include actually a diverse range of topics, going from water management, agriculture, food security, or forest, which are actually some of the major sectors that are priority for least developed countries. Next, please. The adaptation fund has an access process, so that countries have to go through this process in order to access money from the adaptation fund. And this process is including assessment of level of vulnerability, to which extent this country has ecosystems or populations or groups of people that are vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, the level of urgency and risk, whether, although the presence of this vulnerability, whether this is urgent to address or not, as well as ensure equitable access to fund is balanced between countries and even in the country between the most vulnerable ecosystems or groups. The access process also is giving importance to the lessons that have been learned. Like I have said, when this fund has been created, people really wanted to learn about adaptation. So learning from adaptation actions implemented at the ground was a key element for this fund. Securing also regional benefits where possible. As you already know, the impacts of climate change can be transboundary. So the more we have regional benefits, the more the adaptation fund is willing to finance. Maximize also multi-sectoral and cross-sectoral benefits because of the nature of cross-sector and cross-boundary characteristics of climate change, as well as foster capacity to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. Next, please. And in this slide, you can see the different steps in the adaptation fund project cycle. Actually, it is a step composed of it is a process composed of 6 steps. The first one related to submitting the proposal itself to the adaptation fund board secretariat using a template. So there are some templates that you have to use in order to prepare project proposals to the adaptation fund. And once you submit these proposals, the second step will be for the adaptation fund secretariat to look at the consistency and the technical review of the proposal. And then the third step is about to analyze and make an in-depth review by a special committee, which is looking at the content of the proposal itself. And then at a fourth stage, the project review and the adaptation fund board decision. After this review, the Adaptation Fund Board will give its decision regarding the proposal. At a fifth stage, we have the procurement by the Adaptation Fund and the disbursement of the funds by the trustee. And then the sixth and the last stage, which is about the implementation, which is also including monitoring and evaluation. Actually, monitoring and evaluation has become a key element for major funds, including the Adaptation Fund. Next, please. In this slide, we are showing the eligibility criteria of the Adaptation Fund. We have in this process, we have 5 key eligibility criteria. The first one is the eligibility of the country itself. Since the Adaptation Fund is a fund related to the Convention on Climate Change, so the first criteria will be to check the eligibility of the country with regard to the convention itself. And then second, look at the project itself, eligibility, whether it is covering the different topics and sectors and domains I have mentioned previously, in which the Adaptation Fund is putting a priority. And the third criteria is the resource availability. As like I have said, the resources from the Adaptation Fund are coming from CDM project as well as bilateral donors. So it depends whether the Adaptation Fund has the resources or not. And then the fourth one is the eligibility of the nationally implement entity or multilateral implementing entities. Like I have said, these are the entities that are actually interacting. These are the partners of the Adaptation Fund. So the fund will look at the eligibility of these entities that have been designated at national or at international level to serve as the channel for the project on behalf of the country. And then the last one is related to the implementation arrangements. It is important to, during the implementation, that the project is complying with some of the elements that are important for the Adaptation Fund, like I have said also in previous slides. Next, please. In this slide, we are looking at a special program of the Adaptation Fund. Actually, one of these major special program is the preparatory program, which is about to help countries to get ready with their project proposal documents. And the objective of this preparatory program is simply to strengthen the capacity of national and regional implementing entities to directly access the funding from the Adaptation Fund, and the management of the project programs from design until the implementation, as well as the monitoring and evaluation. So the Adaptation Fund is actually putting effort in terms of building the capacity of the country recipient in all these aspects. And the activities included in this program is to support the accredited implementing entities, as well as to support cooperation and partnership, to support accreditation with countries in which they are in the process of the accreditation of their entities, as well as to support knowledge management. Like I said, learning from actual project on the ground is a key element for the Adaptation Fund. Next, please. And like I have said, we have been focusing so far on the Adaptation Fund, let us now look at the Global Environment Facility. Next, please. With regard to the Global Environment Facility, we will also talking about the history of the fund itself, as well as talking about its objectives, about its membership and beneficiary countries, as well as the different funds that are affiliated to the GCF. In terms of the history, just to say that it has been created actually a long time ago, since the beginning of the different negotiations at the level of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change in 1992 during the Rio summit, and later it has become a financial mechanism for several important environmental conventions, like we will see in later slides, with the objective to help developing countries and countries with economics in transition. So the focus is really on the developing countries. And so far, it has up to 184 states that are referred to as participants to the GEF. And beneficiaries are actually government institutions. They could be also civil society organizations, as well as private enterprises and any private sector stakeholder. And it is also important to say that the World Bank actually is the GEF trustee. It is the GEF trustee in charge of managing the GEF funding, GEF funding at country level, as well as seeking contributions from countries. And also to say that GEF is actually serving as administrator for several trust funds, including the climate change trust funds and other funds also, like we will see in the next slides. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we are showing the GEF funding sources. Where is the GEF money actually coming from? This money is coming from two major sources: funding sources provided by the donor countries, like I have said a few seconds ago, and then financial contributions are replenished every 4 years. And in this graphic, you can see the extent to which the funds available within the GEF have been evolving since 1991, which was actually the pilot phase of the GEF, until nowadays in 2022. So you can see that this funding has been increasing so far. Next, please. And in this slide, we are talking about the access to financial resources, as well as in terms of project eligibility criteria, like we have discussed for the Adaptation Fund, and now for the GEF. Here we have also, I think, 5 criteria. The first one is the eligibility of the country, like we have said also for the Adaptation Fund. The second one criteria is the national priority, of whether this project is actually addressing a national priority that has been clearly expressed by the beneficiary country. The third criteria is the GEF priorities. The GEF has its own domains of priorities, so they will check whether the project that has been submitted is actually contributing to achieving these priorities. And then the fourth is whether the funding is available or not, like also for the Adaptation Fund. And then the fifth criteria is participation. The Jeff would like to see inclusiveness of different stakeholders, specifically at country level. Next, please. In this slide, we are focusing on one of the funds that are located within the Jeff, and namely the Special Climate Change Fund. This fund actually has been established since 2001 under the Climate Change Convention. It started with four funding windows, namely adaptation, technology transfer, energy, transportation, industry, agriculture, and waste management, as well as economic diversification to supplement fossil fuel in independent countries. But so far and to date, only the adaptation and the technology transfer windows are active in this special climate change fund. And the fund actually is covering a wide range of adaptation sectors, as well as in terms of the technology transfer. It is addressing technologies that reduce emissions of greenhouse gases or atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. And the funding approval, actually, as of September 30th of the 2020, cumulative funding decisions by the Council and the CEO announced so far an amount of up to $360 million for this special climate change fund. Next, please. And in this slide, like I've said, the Jeff actually is hosting several funds after the special climate change fund. This slide is focusing on the least developed countries fund, which has been established since 2001 at the same year as the special climate change fund and that was by the COP7 that was held in Marrakesh, with the objective of providing a priority support to LDC countries. And this is why this fund is named Least Developed Countries Fund, and specifically for the preparation and the implementation of NAPAs. As you may already know, NAPAs are documents that are only targeting least developed countries in order to reduce the vulnerability of key sectors identified through the NAPAs, as well as target sectors like agriculture, water, food security, and so on. Funding approvals as of September 2020, cumulative funding decisions by the CEO of the least developed country fund, they amounted up to 1.5, a little bit more than 1.5 billions of dollars. And of the cumulative amount approved, 1.3 billion actually was for preparation of project activities, while around 133 million was for fees, and other 16 million was for admin and expense and corporate activities of the fund. Next, please. And after focusing on the adaptation fund and the Jeff, we will now focus on the green climate fund. Next, please. And next slide, please. And even like we have done for the adaptation fund and the Jeff, we will be also talking about the history of the green climate fund. Just to say that it has been established in 2009 as part of the Copenhagen Accord during the COP15. where in the decision of the COP, there was the mention of a Green Climate Fund for the first time. And then in 2010, the Green Climate Fund officially established at the next COP in Cancun. It was formally established. And in 2011, we had the governing instrument for the GCF that have been adopted in Durban at COP17. And then later in 2015, first projects were approved by the GCF board members. And at that time, the operationalization of the GCF was definitely in progress. Next, please. So far, we have talked about the adaptation fund. We have talked about the GEF, but actually, the Green Climate Fund has something that is special. It has something that is making it different from other funding mechanisms or from other funds. And these elements that makes the GCF different are actually four. The first one is related to the scale and the impact that the Green Climate Fund is targeting. For instance, the Green Climate Fund is currently the largest and the fastest growing climate fund so far. It is also promoting what they call a paradigm shift. The Green Climate Fund understands that in order to make impacts, it is not going to make impacts alone. It has to rely also on the willingness of the countries to go beyond the results of the projects being funded by the Green Climate Fund and look at transformative behavior following the implementation of these projects, which is about the paradigm shift. And also with the Green Climate Fund, it is supporting a country-led, and it also has to be in line with country priorities, and it should also in the near future become the main global fund for climate finance. And the second element, which is about governance, it is actually one of the rare funds in which the most vulnerable countries, and specifically the LDCs and the SEEDs, are having specially dedicated seats in the boards of governance of this fund. And the third element related to access, it is also promoting direct access through international and regional and intermediaries. And in terms of the allocation, one of the key elements of the Green Climate Fund is that it is promoting a balance between adaptation and mitigation. Like I have said, for instance, for the adaptation fund, it was essentially on adaptation because people do not know more about adaptation, since most of the actions have been oriented on mitigation. But with the Green Climate Fund, there was the need to correct that kind of mistake and ensure a balance between adaptation and mitigation. Next, please. And in this slide, we are looking at the different areas in which the Green Climate Fund is putting its supports. Like I have said, the fund is willing to have a balance between adaptation and mitigation. And in this slide, you can see there is actually a wide range of activities that the Green Climate Fund is supporting, from energy generation in the side of mitigation up to the infrastructure and built environment in the side of adaptation. Next, please. And in this slide, we are asking the question, actually, who are the main actors of the Green Climate Fund institutional architecture, like we have made also for the other funds we have talked about so far? The GCF institutional architecture is composed of key actors like the national designated authorities. They serve actually as the core interface between the country and the GCF, and they play an important role in coordination of the GCF activities. And they also provide with no objection letter, yes or no objection letter with regard to the project itself. We have also the accredited entities. The fund is accessed actually through these accredited entities. They could be national, regional, and international that have been approved or accredited by the board of the Green Climate Fund. And we have also the executive entities actually who are in charge of implementing the action at the ground. Next, please. And like we have said about, we have talked about criteria for accessing the previous funds. In this slide, it's about talking about the investment criteria for the Green Climate Fund. The first investment criteria is the impact potential, which is about the extent to which the project or the program that is going to be funded has a potential to create an impact on the beneficiary targets. The second one is the paradigm shift. Like I have said, the GCF would like to see transformation occurring thanks to the implementation of the project that the fund has been funding. The third criteria is sustainable development potential. And specifically, the sustainable development goals that are a priority for the country. The Green Climate Fund would like to see that the project it is funding is also contributing to these sustainable development goals that are priority for the beneficiary countries. The fourth criteria is whether the project is actually addressing and expressed needs from the recipient country or contributing to existing policy at country level. The fifth criteria is the country ownership. The country has to be at the stage of the project generation until its development, until its implementation and monitoring and evaluation. The Green Climate Fund would like to see ownership of the country. And then the sixth criteria, which is also actually related to value for money, the Green Climate Fund would like to see the efficiency and the effectiveness of the project. Next, please. And in this slide, we are looking at the Green Climate Fund updated project and program cycle. And this cycle actually is starting from country and regional and accredited entity programs. The GCF has an amount of money that it can allow, that it can allocate to countries in order to get prepared or in order to set up their accredited entities at country level. And then the generation of the programs. When the institutional architecture is set up, the second phase in this cycle will be to generate program and projects funding proposals. And then the concept note, to develop a concept note. And I have put in bracket, this is not mandatory, because the country can go straight to the development of the funding proposal itself. But for sure, taking into account the templates that the GCF has provided. And then we have the Secretariat analyzing with an independent technical assessment and recommendation to the board for the GCF to make a decision. And once the decision has been made, then the legal arrangements for approved proposals will start. Next, please. And like we have said, we have discussed about special program for ODA funds. Let us look at special programs under the Green Climate Fund. We have the Readiness Program. The Readiness Program, like I have said, it is a program that is allowing country parties to have $1 to $2 million every year to get ready in order to get to on board for the process of accessing funds through the Green Climate Fund. Another program of the fund is the project preparation facility. It is a facility that is acknowledging maybe the lack of human capacity from beneficiary countries. Then the GCF is providing with this technical assistance to help the countries go through the entire process of making proposals to the fund. The GCF also has a private sector facility. As you may already know, most of the funding have either a grant part or a loan part, and most of the loan part is being provided by the private sector. And this facility is also there to help the private sector understand also the issue of climate change and encourage the private sector to invest also in the climate action. Another program is related to enhance direct access. We have talked about direct access for previous fund like the Adaptation Fund, but with the Green Climate Fund, there was the recognition that even if we had this direct access, it has to be enhanced with more facilities for the countries that are preparing proposals to access the fund. Another program is related to the facility to simplify approval process. In this case, also, the GCF recognizes that many countries have been raising the issue that the process have been complicated, and then in order to address this complicated process of accessing fund, the GCF has put in place this program in order to simplify approval process of proposals. And the last special program is related to support micro and small medium sized enterprises programs. I think this is also part of this paradigm shift that the Green Climate Funds wants to see at country level. Beyond investing in projects, the GCF would like to see a transformation occurring at the country level. And one of the elements of this transformation is to see the creation of micro enterprises because of the funding from the Green Climate Fund. Next, please. In this slide, we are looking at the strategic priorities over the period of 2020 up to 2023 of the Green Climate Fund. And these priority areas are basically four: strengthening country ownership of programming, and fostering a paradigm shift portfolio, catalyzing private finance at scale, because so far the private finance has been really very slow, especially in developing countries, as well as improving access to fund resources. Next, please. After the different funds, we'll now talk about the multilateral development banks, which are also key players in providing windows for climate action. Next, please. Next slide. And some of these, in this slide, you can see some of the major multilateral development banks that are key players in providing climate finance. We will see later some of the programs that are being managed by these multilateral development banks. Next, please. Next slide, yes. And in this slide, we are looking at the contribution actually of the multilateral development banks so far. And specifically in 2021, these MDBs actually provided around $51 billion funding, out of which we have 62% of overall MDB climate finance in climate finance to low and middle income economies, which is quite a big amount so far, as we will see it in later slides. And of this total, more than 33 billion, which is actually 65%, was for climate change mitigation. Like I have said, so far, most of climate action has been targeted on mitigation, and more than 35% of this funding from MDBs have been targeted to adaptation. Next, please. And in this slide, you can see the MDB climate finance contribution by region in low and middle income economics in 2021. And the remark here is to see that major areas, major regions in which these multilateral development banks have been investing climate action include sub-Saharan Africa, which is coming on the top with more than $12 billion. And then we have Latin America with almost $10 billion. And then at the third level, we have South Asia with around $8 billion. Next, please. So after talking about the different funds as well as the multilateral development funds, we thought that carbon market is another source of funding for climate action. Next slide, please. In terms of overview on carbon market, just to say that carbon markets are trading systems in which carbon credits are sold and they are also bought. So far, there are up to 30 compliance carbon markets operating at global level. And together, these carbon markets reached a value of more than $850 billion in 2021 and covers close to a fifth of global greenhouse gas emissions, which really shows the importance of the carbon markets in climate action. Next slide, please. And in this slide, we are just talking about the areas in which this carbon market is operating. In general, for small-scale AFOLU projects, as you may already know, most of the priority sectors identified in the NDC documents of developing countries are around the AFOLU sector, as well as the carbon markets also have become the CDM market, which is quite complex so far, procedures so far, and methodologies for project registration. And the majority of agriculture and forestry, as well as reducing emission from deforestation, which is RED projects, are unfortunately excluded from the carbon market so far. And the voluntary market has become very important. Like I've said, we have the market which is affiliated to the UN Climate Change Convention, and we have also a voluntary registry in which private sector can go and invest in carbon market. And this voluntary market portfolio has been increasing so far. Next slide, please. In this slide, we are showing the cost of the ton of a certified carbon, a certified emission reduction unit, and you can see that major countries like in the European Union and the UK are offering a better price of metric ton of equivalent CO2, which is reaching up to $120 per metric ton, which means that these carbon markets are very active and very attractive for funders. Next, please. Next slide, please. And we have talked about the clean development mechanism. Actually, it has been defined as part of the Article 12 of the Kyoto Protocol, being replaced now by the Paris Agreement. It allows countries with emission reduction or emission limitation commitment under the Kyoto Protocol to implement emission reduction project in developing countries. So it is really an opportunity for developing countries which is still operating and from which many developing countries have been also accessing climate finance so far. Next slide, please.
Moussa, we're starting to run a little behind, so if you could perhaps speed up a little bit, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I'm at the end of the presentation where I will be talking about adaptation finance. So far, since this project is also about supporting adaptation finance, we thought that it is important to look at some of the major players financing adaptation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, in this graphic, you can see the different multilateral funds supporting adaptation in the period of up to 2021. And you can clearly see that, like I have said, the Green Climate Fund has been a major player in supporting climate action and specifically climate adaptation. Next slide, please. And in this slide, we are rather looking at the contributors in terms of supporting adaptation finance. And we can see that European countries and Germany have been so far the major players in adaptation. Next slide, please. And in this slide, we can see that the sub-Saharan Africa has been attracting the major part of adaptation finance globally so far. Next slide, please. And now we are talking about quickly regional funds. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can see the major regional funds for the Africa region, mostly governed by the African Development Bank. And in the next slide, please, a specific focus on the Sahel Climate Fund that has been launched very recently in October 2022 to address climate finance access in the Sahel region. Next slide. And for the Asia region, this has been so far governed by the Asia Pacific Climate Finance, and that has been managed by the Asian Development Bank. Likewise, for the Africa side, for the African Development Bank. Next and lastly, the national climate funds just to take you through the next slide, please, where we are showing the different countries in which we have existing national climate funds managed by national governments. We can see countries like Bangladesh, Benin, Bhutan, Burkina Faso, or Cambodia, or Chad. Next slide, please. And here also you can see all the other countries in Africa and in Asia that are having their own national climate change funds. Yeah, I think this is the end for my presentation. And next slide, please. And in this slide, you can see more information about what is existing in terms of climate funds. And these platforms are actually being updated very regularly so that you can have a more updated information about all the existing climate funds as well as their requirement for access. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Moussa. That was a very good presentation sweep of all the climate funds that are out there. So thank you very much for that. Next up is Mizan Khan to offer the final presentation on economics and politics of climate finance. So
John, I want to know how much time is left.
We have about 40 minutes, approximately.
Because our purpose should be from this presentation is to build capacity and to make our partners understand better about. So I think we don't have much time for question and answer. That is the main purpose, because this kind of slides can be browsed and downloaded from, including my slides, can be downloaded from internet sources nowadays. So I would have preferred to talk less and allow the participants to ask questions, because many of the people have totally newly facing these kind of issues. So if we only online class, in fact, is not very effective. We don't see anybody, whether they have good attention or not. If we talk and talk, I think then it's not very effective. So I will prefer to share my slides with all the participants and not spend time just to on my part to speak. So let us open the discussion to the floor, because they must be having many questions, and that is the purpose of this.
Okay, thank you very much, Mizan. Well noted. And the reason we did offer these presentations is these are recorded, and the idea was that there would be they'd be shared amongst the team for people who weren't able to participate in the webinar in person. They'd be able to access it later, so they'd have that information. That's why we structured it this way. However, I completely understand and support the idea of much more engagement and question and answers. So I will defer to you.
I can just go over in 5-7 minutes, just because I can talk for hours and hours together. I have written books and many articles published on climate finance. So just I will be happy to have more questions and answers.
Okay. Are there any parts of your slides that you would like to touch on before we go into questions?
Yeah, but I can, instead of going to my slides, I can mention a few of the points that I think Chipo and Moussa have done good jobs, but there are some factual corrections that I want to, because we want that our partners learn the right things. We don't have, for example, polluter pays as an accepted principle, and that is not being applied yet. We are trying our best, including at COP27. It is implied under the CBDRC. respective capability is recognized by the developed country partners, but not the historical responsibility part. That is why polluter pays as a principle is not accepted yet. Then we have, for example, only GCF and Adaptation Fund boards are democratically constituted. Adaptation Fund Board is the most democratic institution in the sense that we have 16 members and 10 members from developing countries and 6 from developed countries. And there is a reason for that, because the capitalization from for Adaptation Fund was supposed to be through the sales proceeds of this ER, Certified Emissions Reduction, the proceeds that we get from the CDM that Moussa has mentioned. And GCF has got 20-member board, 10 from developed countries, 10 from developing countries. And GEF is not a fund under the UNFCCC. GEF is a fund run by the GEF Council and contributed, and voting depends on the money contributed by the parties. GEF is GEF presents a yearly report to the COP for some policy guidance. Other things are absolutely left to GEF and the council. So we cannot and should not say GEF is a fund under the convention. And then we have some other issues that I wanted to. Local ownership development is not mentioned in the in any fund, but now, as Moussa has mentioned, GCF Adaptation Fund has started a little before under the EDF Expedited Direct Access Program, and GCF also has now started under 4 climate pilot programs with $20 million each, where they are trying to promote local ownership. But the developing country ownership is a real challenge, because if the consultants lead the process, then country ownership will never develop. Once the consultants take the lead, the national government officials, NGO leaders, and the think tanks take a back seat. This is what is happening for the last 30 years. And then I have another point, for example, do no harm is not a principle accepted under the climate regime. Do no harm is implied. In my book, I have a chapter that in the European Union, do no harm as a sacrosanct principle has been codified. Even in America, it is not codified as yet. So we would have been happier, LDC countries or LDCs have been happier if this do no harm, because climate change does harm to development rights, violates development rights, but attribution science is not still developed, so we cannot pinpoint which country is doing what level of harms, so these are the points that I wanted to share. Okay. And not that loans are only provided, are taken by the private sector. Private sector, in LDCs, for example, private sector is not active in getting funding, and many of the LDCs have not gotten any fund yet, but about 70% of the money to the LDCs even go as loans, not grants. And all these numbers, for example, developing countries and LDCs don't believe in these numbers. Developing countries, LDCs believe in the Oxfam report, because all these numbers are kind of inflated for 2 reasons. Because developed countries mention these numbers under the Rio markers. Germany, for example, deflates down these Rio marker numbers by 50%. It is extremely inflated, and it is subject to each country's prerogative that under what convention they will put a name, what share of money. So there is double, triple, quadruple counting. And also the money is provided as loans at face value, not at its grant equivalent. So for these 2 reasons, the amount pledged and delivered by the developed countries are inflated by 3 or 4 times more. Okay, so these are some of the issues that I have mentioned. And climate finance also should include loss and damage funding. And COP7, you all know that there is a fund now established, agreed for, but it will take few years for operationalization. So internationally, we are not getting, it's the Himalayan Gulf, orders of magnitude difference between the actual needs, estimated needs by different agencies, and the actual. One report by former UN former Adaptation Fund chair, Mr. Farooq from Pakistan, who was at COP. His calculation is that for the last 20 years, developing countries have got only $6 to $7 billion as adaptation finance. So there are lots of creative accounting. We have a publication in Nature last year where we have discussed about this creative accounting process. And this is the reason for the last quarter of a century, we could not have a definition of climate finance. What is climate finance? Nowadays, increasingly ODA and climate finance are mixed. ODA, you know, is an enlightened charity on the part of developed countries, which is used kind of as an instrument of their foreign policies. Okay. And the mission of ODA is to promote the implementation of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, particularly in the poor countries, in the low-income countries. But climate finance is our right because developed countries not should, the language should is recommendatory. But under Article 4.3 of the Convention, 4.4 of the Convention, and Article 9.1 of the Convention, there is clear mention, developed countries shall provide. Shall means, I'm not a lawyer, but I know it is obligatory. And then under Article 9.2, under the Paris Agreement, there is the provision that other countries in a position to do should contribute, referring to higher income developing countries. So here, so we need to understand the difference between shall and should. Should is recommendatory, which has been applied to the case of high-income developing countries. Yes, there are many, many different developing, high-income developing countries whose income is much higher than many of the now developed countries. Okay, so from the LDC side, we also support that those developing countries, those big emitters with high income should also contribute, because the pendulum has changed. In 92, we have started with 70 versus 30% of emissions, 70% by the global north and 30% by the global south, 100 for more than 150 countries. Now the pendulum has changed. Now 65% is emitted by the developing countries and 35% only by the developed countries. So our responsibilities are increasing. As time will pass, developing countries will have more and more emissions because their growth is needed and their poverty reduction and all those. Obviously, for right reasons, their emissions will go up. But we must strive for decarbonization, and there are absolutely win-win options. And in one slide, I mentioned that why climate action, for example, is not having any action much. I wrote in my book, and I use the expression, this whole negotiation process is a process of active inaction. This is kind of my own expression. These are more talk shops. I attend negotiations only to listen to this and write some articles or books or something. But we have two kind of COPs. One is talk shops, talk COPs, which as negotiators I attend, and one is action COPs, which beyond the government negotiating circles, NGOs, INGOs and NGOs, local and national and international NGOs are doing lots of side events where they share their experiences. And that is what is more important to us, to LDCs and other developing countries, because the peanuts that we get is really not worth of the time invested for having these peanuts now, because our economies are growing and we can do even without this little amount of support. Because for submission of a proposal, What are the criteria? For example, in this year, now I have example, Malawi had many examples. Malawi had a project submitted, and after 4 years, their approval, they have got approval. So minimum 2 years of time needed, but climate normal extreme events.
Mizan, we've lost you temporarily at least, but I just want to say thank you very much because those were really important comments and reflect your deep perspectives and knowledge on this issue. And I think very, very beneficial to the aims of this webinar series. And since you're temporarily not able to talk, I think I will take your advice, and rather than go through yet more PowerPoint slides, we'll end the presentation part of this session and open it up to questions and interventions from the participants. So I leave it open. Please raise your hand if you have any questions or comments about any of the presentations or the remarks that Mizan has made, the very helpful remarks. I think he really touched on some of the true political issues that underlie a lot of this area of climate finance. Serge, please go ahead.
Okay, hi, John. No, it was just because some participants was notifying that the presentation was stagnant. I just want to let everyone know that since we don't have enough time for discussion, Professor Mizan was going through the most relevant point of the missing a slide. So we are going to share that with you after the webinar. But now I think the 30 minutes left, we are going to, or 25 minutes, we are going to spend to have this question and answers. And to let John know that we already have 3 questions on the chat. So maybe we can start from that and give back the floor to the participant. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. Can you direct us, please, to the 3 questions?
Okay, so yeah, I think this one, Professor Mizan has started to answer. Is there one question regarding the loss and damage mechanism? I know that was one of the key topics during COP27. So he started to talk about that. Maybe he wants to come back on that in 1 minute to say where we stand now regarding the establishing of the loss and damage mechanism. That is one question from Professor Amadou Gay.
Okay, thank you. And the other 2 questions, are what are those related to?
Actually, it's 2 questions. The other is some participants asking if they're going to have access to the presentation. So I already confirmed that we are going to share the presentation with everyone. So the other question, maybe let me just read it for you all, is from Professor Ayal. He said, currently the frequency and magnitude of climate and dust disaster has been increasing, as well as the number of victims. And at the same time, we can see a big financial gap between adaptation and mitigation. So the question is how the situation can impact on the capacity of a developing country to improve resiliency, knowing that they have a lack of access to adaptation financing. And in the same time, in the question, he's wanting to know which should be the priority, adaptation or mitigation for developing country. And finally, how to evaluate public-private collaboration to channel climate finance effectively and efficiently to respond to climate change actual and potential impact. So yeah, I think both Professor Mizan or Moussa can come to some of those questions to provide clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have Mizan on, or is he still trying to join again? If not, Moussa, do you want to, Moussa or Chipo, do you want to answer these questions?
Yeah, maybe I can try to answer the question with regard to the gap between adaptation and mitigation. I think the good thing is that the international community has now clearly recognized that this gap between adaptation and mitigation has to be filled, and for many reasons. Some of these reasons include the fact that because of the urgency of the climate crisis, the impacts
I'm sorry, I got cut off. Sorry, Moussa, just 1 minute, one minute. Yeah, I got cut off. I'm not sure whether my interventions are audible or you got to hear. I'm not sure.
We heard a lot of your interventions. They were excellent. They helped to stimulate discussion. And so Moussa right now is answering the question about adaptation or mitigation, and then like to.
Sure. Now,
And
Moussa,
then
please.
after he finishes, we'd like to hear from you about loss and damage funding and more information.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. Please go ahead, Moussa.
Yeah, so I was saying that the international community is progressively recognizing that this gap between adaptation and mitigation has to be filled, and for many reasons. Some of these reasons include the fact that the impacts of climate change have now become widely present. We have seen huge floods in northern countries. We have seen wildfires in other countries in the northern side, and we have been seeing many climate disasters appearing almost everywhere in this planet. And in order to address these climate impacts, we have seen also the limitation of mitigation. So far, countries have not been able to achieve the target of the 1.5 limitation of global rise to the temperatures. And then people no longer have choice than to invest in adaptation. And in order to do that, we have seen the creation of big international frameworks around adaptation. We have, for instance, the Global Center on Adaptation. We have the Global Research Center on Adaptation. We have the Global Goals on Adaptations. And all these global initiatives on adaptations are now recognizing the urgency of fostering adaptation and ensuring that it is at least at the same level as mitigation. And this has been recognized by the Green Climate Fund funding architecture. And we believe that if all these global initiatives are coming into reality, we will fill this gap between adaptation and mitigation and foster the resilience of communities and the ecosystems. Thank you.
Okay, John, if you allow me, I give kind of some input before Professor Mizan answer the question.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, well, just to add to what Moussa said regarding the gap in assessing adaptation and mitigation financing, to say that climate funds like the Green Climate Fund, for example, already established a 50-50 process to allocate resources to both adaptation and mitigation. So that means that it's already well recognized that developing countries need as well a resource for adaptation than for mitigation. But the challenge we find ourselves through the support we provided to developing countries in recent years is a lack of capacity to structure and develop adaptation projects. That's why, although those resources are available for adaptation, it's very difficult for the country to build a strong climate rationale to the adaptation project, and developing a mitigation project, especially in the sector of energy and lately agriculture, make it easier for those countries. And I think is one of the objectives of the UNI-LEAD project is also to build capacity within the think tank to be set up so we can support the government in building those capacity to be able to propose, to develop and submit adaptation projects to global fund like the Green Climate Fund. So yeah, is what I just wanted to add, John.
Thank you, Serge. And it's good to get the perspective in terms of bringing that back to what this project's trying to achieve. Mizan, if you want to talk briefly about loss and damage, and then we have a question from Professor Bazuru after that. In the chat.
Sure.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, such excellent point you brought up, because the purpose of this project is to build capacity at the country level. Thank you. Yeah, loss and damage, you know, the history, it started from 1991 by the AOC's countries, the Alliance of Small Island States, proposed by Vanuatu, but then it was not accepted. But instead, under Article 4.8 of the convention, insurance as a mechanism has been accepted. And then loss and damage expressions was not there. Only in Bali at COP 13 in 2007 in the decision text, this loss and damage expression has been adopted. And then at COP 19 in 2013 in Warsaw, the Warsaw International Mechanism has been established, and under which an executive committee, 11-member executive committee has also been established. And for the last few years, we have been, as negotiators, we have been demanding loss and damage finance facility. But in Glasgow, and the CVF was also very instrumental. You might be knowing about Climate Vulnerable Forum. It's not a negotiating group. It's a politically, very highest level political lobbying group led by the presidents and prime ministers. Now we have 60 members under the CDF. Bangladesh was shared just up to this COP, and now Ghana leads. So that CVF was also extremely active in lobbying in Glasgow at COP26. So as a result, and the UK was also, as a formal colonial power, kind of was a little sympathetic to its former colonies. So they have accepted to some extent, but the climate loss and damage finance facility was not accepted. Then instead, from the text that was deleted, and the Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage was adopted, and every year dialogue will continue until 2024. But this year at the SB session, now Pakistan chairs the group of 77, the broad umbrella group. We have many splinter groups. LDC is one group, for example, but our big broad group is LDC G77, where membership is about 135 countries. So in Pakistan, this extreme heat, in India, this extreme heat, abnormal heat, and this was attributed to human-induced climate change. Then Pakistan had this unprecedented flood. Okay, Germany also had, but they had the ability, and German invested about $14 billion. You know, we don't get peanuts, and that I have no question for that, because their citizens' security is their first priority. But the obligation they are not carrying out. That is what we are after them. So G77 in SB, you know, under the UNFCCC, we have 2 regular meetings minimum. One is the subsidiary body meetings held in June at the UNFCCC Secretariat in Bonn, and the other, the regular process of COP. So at this last SB session, the Pakistan chaired and was very active in demanding, and whole G77 countries was united for the first time on demanding a loss and damage financing facility. Then they have written a letter to the UNFCCC Secretariat, and the Secretariat was forced to, was bound to accept this agenda, that loss and damage finance facility, and sub-item is specifically financing for loss and damage. So, and you know, every COP now gets extended over 1 or 2 days, because the last minute decisions usually always centers around climate finance. That is why we even buy tickets 1 or 2 days after the scheduled dates. This time also we did that. We knew that it will spill over for a day or 2. And so finally, this decision text includes establishment of a financing facility for loss and damage. And there has been, there will be a transition committee comprised of, as I remember, 23 members, and the mention is there also for which countries how will represent. We have 5 UN groups, for example, 3 from the Latin American countries, 3 from the AOC's countries, 2 from the LDCs, like that, 20. So it will take, dear participants, multilateral process is very time consuming, very procrastinating. It's kind of endless process. So it will take, again, few years. You see, this LDC fund, for example, or Special Climate Change Fund or Adaptation Fund was initiated at COP7 in 2001, but it was, they were personalized in 2010. 2009 or 10. So we are optimistic that we will have some fun. But now the question is how much we will be getting in for adaptation and how much we will be getting for loss and damage. Thank you, John.
Thank you,
Hello?
Mizan. Thank you.
Yeah.
There was one question as to whether participants can get your book in the PDF version. Do you have a PDF version that you can put on the project website on your book on climate finance?
I don't have PDF version ready, but I will send it to you and then you can share it to all the participants.
Okay, that sounds wonderful.
Okay.
Professor Bizuru and
Or John, or
Yeah.
you can convert these my slides that I have sent you in PDF and share with all of them.
We will be
And not
sending-
just my slides, not just my slides. I'll request all the slides
We
from
will.
Moussa, from Chipo, to make kind of one PDF file and then share with everybody.
We plan to do that, and we'll also share the
Yeah.
recording of this webinar.
Sure.
So there's a question from Professor Bizuru to Moussa. What are the requirements to become an accredited entity recognized by GCF funds? Are universities or centers of excellence eligible? So do you have an answer for that, Moussa? Or Sarah?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Elias, for that question. I would maybe summarize the process in 2 stages. Like I have mentioned in the criteria for accessing the GCF funding, the country has to go through, for instance, through its focal point, its Green Climate Fund focal points, to identify an accredited entity. And one of the first stage will be to request, for instance, a letter of nomination that this focal point will send to the Green Climate Fund, saying that the country has accepted or has chosen this institution to be accredited to the Green Climate Fund. And once this letter of nomination has been sent by the Green Climate Fund focal point at country level, then there is a long process of institutional assessment. And through this institutional assessment, the Green Climate Fund will assess the institutional capacity of the organization to be an accredited entity to the Green Climate Fund. And some of the elements of this assessment include, for instance, the verification of the fiduciary standards, all the fiduciary norms with regard to managing funds. This is one big component. Another big component is related to gender inclusion and social safeguards. This is another big component. And also there is another big component related to technical aspects, where the Green Climate Fund would like to assess the extent to which the institution already has capacity in previous management of climate change projects, either with regard to adaptation or mitigation. And all this actually is being, all this information is being provided to the Green Climate Fund through a kind of template in which the institution will fill in all this information based on the institutional assessment. And once this information is collected, the Green Climate Fund is providing with a kind of a window, online window, where the institution can go and put all this information, and then the process could start. Here in Niger, we have been supporting some institutions to be accredited, but I would basically say that these are the first steps with regard to the nomination and regard to the institutional assessment around gender, around technical aspect, as well as around fiduciary elements of managing funds. And we can also provide with more details about this process after this webinar if needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Moussa. That was very helpful. Any other? We have 10 more minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. Any other questions from people? And we are available to answer questions offline as well, after you've looked at the slides, if there's anything that stimulates a question. Yeah.
In fact, John,
Mm-hmm.
this attention span of human beings is very not very big, and that is why, you know, ad companies hammers down your ears to get them heard. And so online for 2 hours is, you know,
It's a
anyway.
lot. It's a lot. And we
Yeah.
and this is a learning process for us in terms of the amount of formal material versus more question and answer type of format. What we're trying to do with these webinars is to provide a learning resource that people can then share amongst their university colleagues to help
Yes.
strengthen understanding. So that's why we put a lot of PowerPoint in there. But I do certainly understand your concerns, Mizan, about being talked to and not having enough time to really engage on these substantive issues. And I really appreciate your perspective on this, about what's really happening on the ground in terms of climate finance and what we need to consider as we go forward. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
We will be.
And I'm happy, John. And I'm happy, John, that at least we are meeting in person in Kathmandu, so that we can have in-person interaction, which is totally different than online, you know.
I completely agree. I completely agree. And we're really looking forward to that. I know that not everyone on this call can make it, but we know that some of you are coming to Kathmandu. We will have a half-day session on day 3 on the 7th of December, really engaging with you all and talking about this project and trying to address concerns and sort of keep this on track. It's a rather complex project, so it's really important to have face-to-face time. And just to finally say that we will be sending around a survey after this webinar. Chipo will to gauge how effective you felt the webinar was and to get your suggestions on how to improve it going forward. We will be providing probably about another 5, 6, 7 webinars on different topics of climate finance. So this is just the foundational one. So,
John, can I comment on this webinar, the length of webinar?
please do.
Instead of having 2 hours per webinar, why not we reconstruct this and maybe 1 hour webinar, 2-3 days instead of 3 hours, 2 hours. Some of us have so many other things to attend to as well, so it's very much time consuming as I see it right now.
Noted. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very important comment. The 2 hours is a long time to sit through. So I completely hear you on that. Thank you. Okay, any final questions, comments, reflections before we close? No? Okay. Again, thank you very much. And we appreciate this, and we look forward to hearing your feedback on the webinar through the survey we'll be sending around. And look forward to
Yes.
seeing some of you in Kathmandu in about a week and a half. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you,
Yeah,
John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, for
Thank you,
managing
Mizan,
this,
for the nice
Chipo.
reaction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thank you very much.
Yep.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank for all
thank you. Goodbye then.
for the
Thank
good
you. Goodbye.
information.
Bye.